From the moment he stepped into the cage, there was something different about him. It wasn't just the way he fought, though that alone was enough to leave crowds breathless. It was the way he carried the silence before the storm, the way his eyes scanned the arena like a battlefield, calculating, calm, and somehow reverent. There was no cocky swagger, no theatrics or trash talk that had become the norm. Just a quiet storm in a man's frame, built for dominance. As the world screamed for blood and drama, he stood there, a warrior molded by a discipline that ran deeper than combat. It was rooted in legacy. Long before the bright lights of Las Vegas and the thundering applause of packed arenas, there was a young boy in the mountains of Dagestan, wrestling with the wild and training under the harsh eye of a father who believed that strength wasn't given, it was forged. He didn't have much, but he had enough. Enough grit, enough tradition, and enough belief to become something greater. Not just a fighter, but a symbol. A product of isolation and resilience, molded by the peaks and valleys of a harsh land, where survival itself was a kind of training, and every scar told a story. Most children grow up with toys and cartoons. His childhood came with bears, literal ones. The footage went viral years later, the world stunned at the sight of a boy no older than 9 grappling with a bear cub. It wasn't cruelty, not in the way outsiders viewed it. It was a lesson, a message etched deep into the marrow of a young warrior. If you can stand against nature itself, then no man can break you. And that was always the goal, not to win fights, but to become unbreakable. Invincibility wasn't about muscles. It was about mind, soul, and unshakable purpose. His name, Khabib Nurmagomedov, soon carried the weight of inevitability. Not because he demanded respect, but because he earned it with every second spent inside that octagon. He wasn't flashy, and he didn't need to be. Every move was measured, every blow calculated, every round a lesson for the world to study. He didn't fight for fame or fortune. He fought because it was in his blood. Because somewhere between tradition and trauma, between his father's teachings and his homeland's expectations, he discovered something sacred, a reason. And when a man fights with purpose, he doesn't fight to win. He fights because losing is not an option. For years, the UFC had been a stage of showmen and gladiators, boastful, brash, and eager to entertain. Khabib was an anomaly, a paradox in a sport built on spectacle. He didn't dance, he didn't taunt, he subdued. Quietly, methodically, relentlessly. And with every victory, the legend grew. Not just of his skills, but of his story. Fans from all corners of the globe weren't just watching a fighter, they were witnessing a philosophy in motion. Honor, faith, and humility in the face of chaos. He became the storm that didn't roar but rumbled deeply, shaking the foundations of the fight game itself. But to understand him, you can't just watch his highlights or study his stats. You have to peel back the layers, look past the perfect record, and into the man forged by tradition and tragedy. Every time he stepped into the cage, it wasn't just for victory, it was for something more. Something ancestral. Like he was carrying the weight of generations on his back. His every breath felt like a prayer. His every move, a tribute. And when he spoke, it was with clarity and conviction. Not because he sought the spotlight, but because he believed in something higher than applause. There was a turning point in his career, a fight that would define him not just as a champion, but as an icon. The bout was built on tension, wrapped in controversy, and soaked in animosity. The world watched as two ideologies clashed, two very different men with very different values. It was more than a fight. It was a reckoning. Khabib stood firm, unmoved by the chaos. And when the cage door closed, it wasn't just fists that flew. It was years of restraint, of silence, of holding back. When he dominated, it wasn't about proving his worth. It was about defending his principles. In that moment, when the crowd roared and chaos erupted outside the octagon, Khabib didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He didn't raise his hands in theatrical triumph. Instead, he looked inward, like a man searching for peace in the middle of a storm he didn't ask for. He had done what he came to do. The rest, the noise, the drama, the spectacle, was never part of his plan. He wasn't here to entertain. He was here to remind the world that true strength doesn't need to shout. It moves quietly, confidently, and leaves a deeper impact than any staged narrative ever could. But his path wasn't without heartbreak. The anchor of his life, his father, his trainer, his guide, was taken too soon. The man who shaped him, who instilled every ounce of discipline and belief into his being, was gone. And suddenly, the cage felt colder, the cheers more distant. Yet even in grief, Khabib stood tall. He didn't crumble. Instead, he honored his father the only way he knew how, through action. One final fight, one last dance in the cage. Not for glory, not for records, but to fulfill a promise. To end the journey the way it was meant to be, with dignity. And so, on that night, when the lights dimmed and the bell rang, he fought with the heart of a son, not just a champion. Each strike, each takedown, each breath was laced with memory. The world watched in awe, unaware they were witnessing the end of something sacred. He won, as expected. But the real story wasn't the victory, it was what followed. He dropped to his knees, tears carving paths down his face. He laid his gloves on the mat, a gesture louder than any words. In that silence, he spoke volumes. He was done. And just like that, the storm passed. Retirement in combat sports is rarely permanent, often spoken more as a strategy than a truth. But with Khabib, when he said he was done, the world believed him. Because when he spoke, it wasn't from ego. It was from principle. There was no dramatic comeback tease, no cryptic social media hints, just closure. A chapter sealed with integrity. And in that final act, he did what so few could. He walked away undefeated, untarnished, and unshaken. He didn't need more titles. He had already conquered the only battlefield that mattered, himself. In a sport defined by comebacks, his silence was the loudest farewell. What set him apart wasn't just dominance, it was discipline. In an age where attention is currency and controversy equals clout, he resisted the urge to chase spectacle. He wasn't swayed by fame or fortune, despite both following him like shadows. Where others shouted to be heard, he listened. Where others chased drama, he sought peace. Every fight, every press conference, every interview was a masterclass in self-control. He was a man who knew who he was and never compromised it for applause. And that's what made him magnetic. Not just a fighter people admired, but a man people trusted. Behind every decision, there was intention. Behind every moment in the spotlight, there was restraint. While others built legacies off of rivalries and mic drops, Khabib built his off of respect. He gave it, and he earned it. He didn't trade insults to sell fights. He let his silence carry weight. And somehow, that made him even more captivating. The world leaned in, curious about the man who didn't need to yell to be heard. Because in his calm, there was power. A presence that couldn't be faked or fabricated. The kind of aura that turned observers into believers and opponents into admirers. And yet, for all his accolades, the octagon was never his final destination. It was merely a vessel, a means to a greater end, to build something larger than himself, to inspire, to teach, to uplift those who shared his roots, his struggle, his story. Retirement wasn't an end, it was a transition. From fighter to mentor, from student to teacher. He began shaping the next generation, not just with technique, but with values. Reminding young warriors that strength without control is chaos, and fame without humility is hollow. He wanted to build champions not just in the cage, but in character. As his legend grew beyond the sport, so did his message. Interviews, speeches, public appearances, each moment became a platform. But instead of selling products, he shared purpose. He spoke about faith, family, and the quiet power of consistency. His words resonated far beyond fighters or fans. They reached anyone seeking clarity in a noisy world. People saw in him not just excellence, but balance. Proof that you could reach the top without selling your soul. That you could stay grounded while flying high. That legacy isn't just what you achieve, but how you carry it. And still, through it all, he remained elusive. Not in a mysterious way, but in a protected one. He didn't open his life to the cameras. He didn't stage content or craft an online persona. What you saw was what you got. And that authenticity became his armor. It shielded him from the pitfalls of fame. It kept his circle small, his path straight. There were no scandals, no fallouts, No unraveling under pressure, just consistency. And in a world constantly craving newness, that kind of stability became revolutionary. He didn't chase moments, he built momentum. Quietly, powerfully, permanently. Even years removed from active competition, his shadow looms large over the sport. New champions rise, new records are set, but his name still echoes. Not just because of what he did, but how he did it. Undefeated is a statistic. Untouched is a story. And Khabib's story isn't just about avoiding defeat. It's about defining dominance on his terms. It's about elevating the fight game into something more than blood and bruises. It's about showing the world that true warriors don't just conquer opponents, they conquer themselves. And in that self-mastery, they become immortal. Legends usually grow louder after they're gone. But Khabib's mythos grows in silence, in the absence of chaos. In the calm he left behind, he changed the rhythm of the fight world without ever needing to disrupt it. He didn't just win, he rewrote the rules. And now every fighter who enters that cage with humility, with purpose, with control, walks a path he helped pave. Whether they say his name or not, they feel his presence. Because some legacies aren't carried in belts or trophies, they're carried in shifts. Cultural shifts, ethical shifts, shifts in how the game is played and who it's played for. Outside the sport, his life has remained deeply principled. Faith remains his foundation, guiding every step. He speaks often about the importance of prayer, of family, of staying true to one's core. Not because it sounds good, but because it's real for him. It's the same faith that carried him through the brutal training sessions, the spotlight's pressures, and the heartbreaking loss of his father. It's the same belief system that kept him grounded when millions chanted his name. While others found identity in being fighters, Khabib found identity in being a servant to his God, his family, and his people. And perhaps that's what makes his story timeless, because it isn't bound to the sport. It doesn't fade with the next pay-per-view or disappear with a new champion. It lingers, it teaches, it challenges. In a world constantly shifting, Khabib remains a fixed point, a reminder that greatness isn't measured by noise but by depth. That true impact isn't always loud. It can be soft, steady, and unshakable. He didn't just retire undefeated. He exited untouched by the machine. And now, as new voices rise and new narratives form, his story still holds weight. Because in the end, truth always echoes the longest. There's something magnetic about a man who doesn't chase the spotlight, yet becomes its center. Khabib never asked for the world's attention, but it found him anyway. Not because he shouted the loudest, but because he stood firm when others bent. That kind of stability is rare, especially in a world addicted to virality. People couldn't look away, not just because he dominated opponents, but because he reminded them of something forgotten. In his silence, there was strength. In his stillness, there was meaning. And in his unwavering presence, people saw not just a champion, but a standard. A bar set higher than gold belts. The journey to that standard wasn't clean or convenient. It was rough, raw, and real. From the cold gyms of Dagestan to the global stages of the UFC, every step was carved with intention. Nothing was handed to him. No shortcuts, no favors. He wasn't built in performance centers or spotlighted by promoters early on. He was forged in places where Wi-Fi couldn't reach and fame didn't matter. Where discipline wasn't optional, it was survival. And that's what made him different. While others trained to win, he trained to endure, to last, to represent more than himself, to carry a people's pride on his shoulders, and those people, his people, stood with him like a fortress. You could see it in every fight week, every weigh-in, every post-fight celebration. The unity, the respect, the sheer devotion. He didn't just represent a region, he carried a culture that values humility over hype, community over celebrity. And in every interview you saw it. His deference, his gratitude, his constant acknowledgement that he was just a piece of a greater whole. That without his roots, he was nothing. It was a rare kind of fame. The kind that doesn't elevate a man above others, but lifts his entire village with him. But even for someone so grounded, the weight of expectation can be suffocating. The pressure to stay perfect, to remain unbeaten, to uphold an image crafted by millions of fans and an even stricter internal compass. That pressure doesn't show in his face or his tone, but you can feel it in the pauses, in the still moments between fights, in the long stares and the breath held just a second longer than usual. It's not fear, it's reverence. He knew what he represented, and he never took it lightly. And perhaps that's what made every win feel sacred. It wasn't for applause, it was for alignment. Some fighters chase belts, others chase legacy. Khabib chased something even deeper: honor, in every sense of the word. Honor in preparation, in respect for opponents, in the values he carried into every arena. He never looked past a challenger, never disrespected the game. And in return, the game respected him back. Even those who doubted him, who mocked his style or questioned his resume, were silenced, not by words, but by domination. He didn't argue with critics, he dismantled them. And he did so without compromising the quiet dignity that had become his armor. A silent warrior in a loud world. Of course, his greatest rivalries made headlines. The drama, the back and forth, the culture clashes. But strip all that away, and what remained was a man who refused to be pulled into chaos. Even when provoked, even when disrespected, he stood still. Not passive, powerful. His restraint was mistaken for weakness, but it was actually his greatest flex, because he knew that true power doesn't always need to be expressed, it just is. And when the cage closed and it was time to fight, all the noise faded. What was left was pure domination. Not emotional, not reactive, just cold, clinical, undeniable skill. One of the most talked about aspects of his career was his style, what many called boring early on. The relentless grappling, the suffocating pressure, the calculated control. But those who understood the game saw something different. They saw mastery, strategy, the ability to nullify danger before it even formed. He didn't just fight his opponents, he dismantled their identities, made strikers hesitant, made wrestlers doubt, made everyone question their own game plans. He took away hope, piece by piece, until only submission remained. And that's a level of genius most couldn't see until it was too late. That's not boring, that's brilliance. Eventually, people stopped doubting. The narratives shifted. Unbeatable became the norm. Opponents weren't just trying to win, they were trying to survive. Every analyst, every fan, every fighter began to admit what had once been controversial. Khabib wasn't just great. He was special. The kind of athlete that only comes around once in a generation. And not because of talent alone, but because of how that talent was wielded. With discipline, with restraint, with reverence. In a sport where destruction often overshadows dedication, he reminded the world that greatness isn't just about what you do, it's about how you do it. The final fights of his career weren't just wins, they were declarations. Not of superiority, but of completion. Each bout was a chapter closed with conviction, like he had nothing left to prove, not to fans, not to promoters, not even to himself. He didn't just beat the best, he buried any doubts that he belonged among the legends. And when he walked away, it wasn't bittersweet. It was beautiful, because he did so on his terms. No scandals, no late career losses, just legacy, sealed in gold. In a sport known for tragic endings, his exit was a masterpiece, a blueprint others would chase but rarely achieve. And yet, even as the cage door closed behind him, the world leaned in closer, wanting more, wanting one last look, one last quote. But true to form, he offered no drama, only grace, only clarity. And that made the silence louder. Because when a warrior of his caliber speaks with action and departs with peace, the echo lingers. It lives in locker rooms, in press conferences, in gyms around the world. Young fighters mimic his stance, his mindset, his movement, not just in the cage, but in life. He didn't just leave behind wins, he left behind a way, a code. What makes a man walk away from greatness at its peak? That question haunted fans, analysts, and athletes alike. In a sport where careers are extended beyond their natural shelf life, where the hunger for applause often outweighs logic, Khabib's decision to retire undefeated was almost mythic. But for him, there was no confusion. The reason wasn't complex. It was love. It was a promise to a father no longer present in body, but ever present in spirit. A vow whispered in grief, honored in victory. That final fight wasn't just for legacy, it was for closure, for healing, for the one who made the dream possible. His father wasn't just his coach, he was his compass. A man of structure, of vision, of unwavering discipline. From the moment Khabib could walk, Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov had a plan. Not to make his son famous, but to make him unbreakable. And in that rugged terrain of Dagestan, the lessons began early. Wrestling with older boys, running uphill with rocks in his hands, submitting to routines that would break most men. But it wasn't abuse, it was preparation. A father's love expressed through hard edges and exacting standards. And over time, the boy became the embodiment of that vision. Strong, focused, invincible. So when Abdulmanap passed, it wasn't just a personal loss, it was a tectonic shift. The man who guided every step was suddenly gone, and the foundation Khabib stood on felt less stable. Yet in his sorrow, he found resolve. To finish the mission, to honor every early morning, every silent sacrifice, every moment of father-son discipline that few ever witnessed. That final fight wasn't about money, legacy, or belts. It was about goodbye, about proving that everything he was, every principle, every discipline, could still stand without its architect. And when it was done, he knelt in the center of the cage. A champion. A son. The UFC, of course, wanted more. How could they not? An undefeated star in his prime, pay-per-view gold, global reach. But Khabib's values were never for sale. No amount of money could rewrite the vow he made. And when he said, "I give my word," that was final. There were no negotiations, no second thoughts. Because to him, a man is only as strong as the promises he keeps, especially when no one is forcing him to keep them. That kind of integrity confused people in an era where loyalty bends for fame. But in Khabib's world, honor was non-negotiable. Fans grieved his retirement like a sudden blackout. One moment, the light of dominance illuminated the sport. The next, it was gone. And what lingered was awe, and an aching curiosity. What would he have done next? Could anyone have stopped him? But those questions missed the point. Because Khabib didn't need to answer every hypothetical to cement his greatness. He'd already transcended that conversation. Greatness isn't always about how long you reign. It's about how deeply you shape the world while you do. And he'd left fingerprints on every inch of the sport. Indelible. Unmistakable. Permanent. The truth is, most athletes lose themselves in their own myth. They start believing in their invincibility, they stay too long, they fall. But Khabib's genius wasn't just physical, it was emotional intelligence. He knew exactly when to stop. He understood the value of leaving with questions unanswered, with the audience still wanting more. Because in that void, in that longing, legends are born. He didn't need the applause to echo forever. He just needed it to echo honestly. And it has. Every time a new lightweight contender rises, his name is mentioned. Every time greatness is discussed, his shadow appears. What followed his retirement wasn't silence. It was transformation. He stepped into coaching, not to stay relevant, but to give back. To mentor with the same patience and fire his father once gave him. And in this new role, he became a multiplier. His presence elevated fighters not just technically, but spiritually. They didn't just fight better under him, they believed better, trained with more intent, walked taller. Because his philosophy wasn't about brute strength, it was about mental sovereignty. Master your emotions and you master your opponent. Win the war inside and the war outside becomes simple. That's what he preached. That's what he lived. One by one, his protégés began rising, winning, dominating. And suddenly, a new dynasty began forming. Not under banners or brands, but under principles. The Nurmagomedov Code, built on humility, preparation, and unshakable belief. And as the world watched these young warriors climb the ranks, it was clear. Khabib hadn't left the sport. He had just changed its shape. Now his presence stood in corners, whispered through strategy sessions woven into game plans. A quiet general watching his army move. Never boastful. Always focused. Always carrying the torch without needing to hold the spotlight. Outside the gym, his mission expanded. Speaking engagements, humanitarian efforts, cultural representation. He understood that influence wasn't just about attention, it was about direction. So he gave his voice to causes that mattered, to education, to faith, to unity. He didn't preach perfection, but he modeled discipline. Not for show, but because he believed the next generation needed more than just role models. They needed blueprints. Proof that it's possible to rise from obscurity without losing your soul in the process. He became that proof, a living, breathing contradiction to every excuse people made for why honor and success couldn't coexist. And yet, for all the admiration, all the interviews, all the camera flashes, he stayed small in his own eyes. Always redirecting credit, always pointing back to his father, his faith, his community. To him, being great was never the goal. Being useful was. And that subtle shift changed everything. Because usefulness endures. When the lights fade and the applause dies, what remains is impact. And impact doesn't need to trend. It needs to transform. That's what he pursued. That's what he built. And now every young fighter chasing the dream isn't just chasing belts. They're chasing a deeper purpose, one that could be made visible. Legacy for most is a pursuit. For Khabib, it was a byproduct. He never woke up trying to be remembered. He woke up trying to do things right, day by day, hour by hour. Excellence wasn't a goal, it was a standard. And that's what set him apart from the beginning. In a world that glorifies shortcuts, his process was long, deliberate, often unseen. There were no viral training montages or flashy promo clips, just repetition. Quiet mastery in the shadows, and in those shadows, something powerful was born. A man who didn't need the world to notice him, because eventually, it always did. It's rare to find someone so immune to chaos. Trash talk, insults, controversy, none of it penetrated him. That kind of psychological armor isn't built in gyms. It's cultivated through belief, through years of knowing exactly who you are and why you're doing what you're doing. Khabib's strength wasn't just in his hands, it was in his identity. He knew where he came from, what he stood for, what he would never compromise. And when a man has nothing to prove to the world, there's nothing the world can take from him. That's why opponents often looked confused, not just by his skill, but by his calm. That calmness, however, wasn't passive. It was earned, forged through years of mental training that rivaled the physical. His father didn't just teach him how to fight, he taught him how to think, how to breathe through fear, how to respond to rage with clarity, how to see beyond the moment and move with purpose. That's why, even in the tensest stare-downs, he remained unmoved. Why he never blinked in the face of disrespect? Because he wasn't fighting for pride, he was fighting for principle. And that's a fight far harder to derail. It's internal. And once that's won, no man can take it away. And when he entered the cage, it wasn't emotion driving him. It was precision. Every move was calculated, every exchange measured. He didn't waste energy on theatrics. He didn't chase knockouts for the crowd's approval. He fought to win, to dominate, to leave no doubt. That's why his victories weren't just numbers on a record. They were statements, messages sent to the world. This is what happens when discipline outlasts hype, when humility overcomes arrogance, when preparation outpaces potential. His career wasn't built on moments, it was built on momentum. A slow, unstoppable march toward greatness, powered by everything the sport often forgets to value. It's why fans from every corner of the globe saw something in him. Not just skill, but reflection. A mirror of what they wished more athletes would become. Responsible, focused, unshaken. He became more than a fighter. He became a symbol. Especially to the youth. Kids who grew up in hard places saw in him a way out. Not through shortcuts or spotlight chasing, but through structure, through sacrifice. And he didn't just inspire them with words, he showed them step by step how it could be done. Through cold mornings, through injury, through silence, through staying grounded when everything tried to lift him into chaos. And that chaos came often, especially during the biggest moments of his career. Press tours laced with insults, headlines spun for drama, provocations so deep most would have cracked. But not him. He carried himself like a man who had already won something bigger than the belt. Because in his mind, the real victory wasn't inside the octagon, it was outside. In how he carried his family's name, in how he represented his people, and how he made every step forward without ever stepping on someone else's dignity. That's not just hard in combat sports, it's almost unheard of. And yet, he did it. Consistently. Even after the biggest controversies, he refused to be defined by a moment. He never let mistakes, his or others, steer the narrative. He acknowledged them. He grew from them. But he never let them reshape his core. That kind of self-awareness is rare. It's the difference between men who fall under pressure and those who rise because of it. Khabib wasn't flawless, but he was honest. And in that honesty, fans found trust. They knew who he was. They knew what to expect. No gimmicks, no masks, just a man trying to be better than he was yesterday, not better than someone else. In retirement, that mission only grew. With no cameras watching, no fights booked, no legacy left to build, he could have disappeared. But instead, he leaned into service. Building gyms, coaching the next wave, investing in education, empowering youth. Not because it earned headlines, but because it mattered. He understood something too many forget. That impact doesn't always need applause, Madasa. Sometimes it's the quiet work that echoes loudest. The lessons passed down, the lives redirected. And with each student he guided, each message he shared, he planted something bigger than a legacy. He planted a culture shift. A reminder that greatness isn't about a rival, it's about what you do once you get there. The athletes he mentors today aren't just inheriting technique, they're inheriting a mindset. One rooted in patience, faith, and relentless self-discipline. He teaches them to slow down, to think longer, to play the long game. And in an era addicted to fast fame, that message is radical. Revolutionary, even. But it's working. Because fight by fight, win by win, his influence is growing again. Not through him, but through them. Through the men who step into the cage carrying not just skills, but values. And those values, over time, change the sport. Shift the conversation. Redefine what fans cheer for. What young fighters strive toward. And maybe that's the greatest irony of Khabib's story. That by walking away, he became bigger than ever. That in leaving the cage, he entered history. Not as a ghost of what could have been, but as a giant of what already was. His silence now speaks louder than most men's screams. His stillness moves more than knockout reels. And as the years pass, his name remains, not just as a champion, but as a standard. A reminder that in the fight for glory, there's another path. One paved not in fame, but in faith. Not in ego, but in example. And that's a path few dare to take. In the world of sports, there's often a thirst for dominance, a need to prove superiority through spectacle. But Khabib never craved dominance for the sake of power. His victories weren't acts of destruction. They were expressions of order, of balance, of discipline carried to its purest form. Every fight he won wasn't about humiliation. It was about efficiency. There was no need for theatrics, no desire to belittle. Just a quiet, methodical dismantling. A reflection of his inner world. Peaceful, structured, immovable. And that's what unnerved opponents the most. He wasn't fighting them with anger. He was defeating them with calm. With absolute clarity. This clarity stemmed from something deeper than sport. Faith. It wasn't something he marketed. It wasn't painted across banners or shouted into microphones. It lived in his actions, in his restraint, in his humility, in his refusal to bask in praise or retaliate with ego. Islam wasn't just a religion to him, it was a compass, a system of self-regulation that kept him grounded when the world tried to pull him into chaos. And when fans around the globe watched him prostrate in gratitude after every fight, they weren't just witnessing a ritual, they were witnessing surrender. Not to opponents, but to something higher. And that kind of spiritual conviction is magnetic, especially in a sport drenched in ego. Khabib stood as an anomaly, strong yet soft-spoken, fierce yet centered. He reminded people that belief, when lived with authenticity, isn't restrictive. It's empowering. It gives purpose to pain, direction to discipline, and in a society increasingly defined by confusion and identity crisis, his example offered something rare: clarity, not in the form of perfection, but in unwavering values. And for millions, that was revolutionary. Because here was a man at the peak of worldly success who never bowed to it, who walked away with his soul intact. His influence reached far beyond Dagestan. From Southeast Asia to Africa, the Americas to the Middle East, young men watched him and found new hope. not just to be fighters, but to be better sons, better students, better men. In a time when masculinity is often confused with aggression, Khabib redefined it. He showed that strength doesn't need to be loud, that honor doesn't have to come at someone else's expense, that you can be devout without being divisive. His example became a bridge for cultures, for generations. And in every corner of the world, boys wore his name not because he won, but because of how he lived and how he carried others. Loyalty for him wasn't selective, it was sacred. The same team that trained with him from the beginning stood by his side at the end. He never replaced them with super trainers or media consultants. He built with them, grew with them, shared every victory, every setback. And when it was time to give back, he didn't look elsewhere. He turned inward, to his people, his region, his roots. That kind of commitment builds more than careers, it builds legacy. And that legacy now lives not just in the record books, but in the villages and gyms of Dagestan, where boys grow up believing they can rise too. And rise they do. Not because they were handed a path, but because they saw someone walk it first. Someone who showed that it was possible to be great without compromise. Who proved that resilience isn't forged in luxury, but in struggle. Who lived proof that discipline isn't a punishment, it's a liberation. And in every young fighter now emerging from his camp, there's a spark of that same fire. A focus that can't be bought, a hunger that can't be faked. They don't just carry his name, they carry his blueprint. And with it, they walk into the future with more than gloves. They walk with purpose. Still, with all this growth, Khabib remains elusive. Not in an arrogant sense, but in the way all truly focused people do. He doesn't seek attention, it finds him. He doesn't chase relevance, it follows him. Because real power never has to raise its voice. And when he speaks, people listen. Not just because of his fame, but because of the silence that surrounds his words. He talks with intention, pauses with weight. And in a world drowning in noise, that kind of presence is priceless. It reminds us that wisdom isn't about knowing everything. It's about knowing what not to say and when. But don't mistake that quiet for softness. His will is steel. It's what drove him through freezing runs, painful cuts, and suffocating pressure. It's what helped him walk away from millions without a second thought. And it's what now fuels his next mission, changing lives. Not with punches, but with perspective. Not in the ring, but in this phase, many argue, might be even more powerful than his fighting career. Because now he's not just reaching fans, he's shaping futures. Teaching boys how to control emotion, how to endure pain without letting it twist them, how to win, and more importantly, how to lose with honor. And as he builds this empire of values, he's doing something even rarer. He's rewriting the archetype. For decades, fighters have been told that aggression sells, that controversy draws, that persona is more important than principle. But Khabib flipped the script. He proved that authenticity is just as marketable, that humility can win just as loud, that realness, when combined with mastery, becomes unstoppable. And now entire organizations are taking note. Trainers reevaluating what they teach, promoters rethinking what they celebrate, fans slowly shifting what they cheer for. The ripple effect is real. It's subtle, yes, but unmistakable. And it started with one man refusing to bend. And yet, for all his accomplishments, he never claims to have it all figured out. He admits mistakes, learns in public, evolves. That's what keeps him relatable, because people don't just admire him, they believe him. They trust that his success wasn't luck or image, but earned through decades of invisible struggle. And that makes his story more than a highlight reel, it makes it a map. For anyone chasing excellence without losing their soul. For anyone trying to walk the narrow path between greatness and humility. And as long as that map exists, Khabib will never truly be gone. His journey continues, not in the cage, but in every soul he's touched. As time moved on, Khabib began to transform from a fighter into a phenomenon. Not in the way celebrities often do, inflated by branding or curated presence, but in the rare way movements are born, quietly, purposefully, from deep resonance. He stopped being just a name on a poster and became a symbol carried across borders and languages. A symbol of discipline in a distracted world, of loyalty in an age of self-interest. And with every person who adopted his mindset, his values, his ethic, his influence grew wider, deeper. Because when someone proves greatness is possible without compromise, they don't just win fans, they create believers. Those believers weren't all fighters either. They were students, workers, fathers, sons, people who had never thrown a punch in their life but saw in Khabib a model for how to carry themselves, and how to respond to provocation with composure, how to work without applause, how to win without arrogance. In many ways, his legacy became a form of quiet rebellion against the loud, attention-starved culture that dominates modern media. And slowly, you could feel the tide shift. From highlight reels to full stories. From viral trash talk to enduring values. It wasn't just that he was different, it was that he made others want to be different too. And still, despite the fame, he never changed pace. While others scrambled to stay relevant post-retirement, he remained still steady. No scandals, no unnecessary interviews, just action. Teaching, building, listening, living. That level of restraint in a hyper-exposed world felt alien, almost like a throwback to an older kind of heroism. One not defined by reach, but by respect. He didn't need to trend because his influence wasn't seasonal. It was generational. You couldn't scroll past it, you had to sit with it. Let it speak to you, let it challenge you. And that challenge, be better, go deeper, stay grounded, wasn't flashy, but it was unforgettable. He also showed us something we often forget, that silence can be louder than spectacle, that a man who chooses his words carefully, who doesn't chase headlines, who protects his privacy and peace, can still lead millions. In a digital age where clout often replaces credibility, Khabib reminded us that legacy is not measured in likes. It's measured in how many lives you touch without needing to be seen, in how much you give away without expecting it back. And with every gesture of humility, every act of mentorship, every promise kept quietly, his voice grew louder in the hearts of those who understood him. Perhaps most impressive was how he balanced his roles. Fighter, son, coach, leader, businessman, servant. He didn't prioritize one at the expense of the others. He found harmony. When he spoke of his father, it wasn't just as a mentor, it was as a compass. Someone whose values still lived in his every action. And now when he teaches, it's not just technique, it's legacy. He's not trying to clone himself in others. He's trying to raise men who think for themselves, who lead with principle, who rise without ego. In every gym session, in every conversation, he's depositing values that may never make the news, but will last a lifetime. And that's the real mark of greatness. Not just how far you rise, but how many you lift along the way. Khabib lifts quietly, strategically. Whether it's funding schools in Dagestan or mentoring the next global champion, his touch is deliberate. And even when his name isn't attached to a project, his fingerprints often are. He doesn't need recognition because the work speaks for itself. And when you talk to those he's helped, you'll rarely hear stories of grand speeches or motivational lectures. You'll hear about presence, accountability, a man who shows up, who listens, who makes time. And in a world starving for real connection, that's priceless. It's this connection, deep, real, and unbreakable, that defines his bond with his fans. They don't just follow his career, they follow his journey, through triumph and tragedy, through loss and love. When his father passed, they grieved with him, not as spectators, but as extended family, because over the years he let them in, not through gossip, but through example. He taught it was about stewardship. How well do you protect what you've been given? How responsibly do you use your platform? That's why even with millions in his account, he still lives simply, eats humbly, speaks modestly. He's a force, not because of how loud he roars, but because of how deeply he resonates. And as the story of Khabib continues to unfold, it becomes clear that this was never just about fighting. It was about choosing a different way. In a world that often rewards chaos, he chose order. In a sport built on ego, he chose humility. In a culture that celebrates excess, he chose simplicity. And through these choices, he carved out something rare: peace. Not the kind you find in comfort, but the kind earned through conflict, through winning the battle within. And in that victory, he became more than a champion. He became a guide for everyone still searching for their own way home. For all the strength Khabib displayed in the cage, perhaps his most powerful moment came outside of it, when he fought through grief, alone, and made the hardest decision of his life. After his father passed, everything changed, not just emotionally, but spiritually. The man who had taught him everything, guided every breath of his career, was suddenly gone. And with that loss came a silence deeper than words. It wasn't a silence of weakness, it was the silence of respect, of mourning, of realization. Because for Khabib, fighting without his father wasn't just difficult, it was directionless. The compass was gone. The mission had shifted. So when he stepped into the cage that final time, facing Justin Gaethje, it wasn't just another defense, it was closure. The culmination of years of discipline, sacrifice, and honor. He fought not just for victory, but for farewell. And when he won, he didn't scream. He didn't pose. He cried. He fell to the mat and let the tears fall, not for himself, but for the man who wasn't there to witness it. That moment pierced through fans around the world. It stripped away the layers of myth and showed us the human underneath. A son, a student, a man letting go of what he loved because love demanded it. And when he took the mic, the message was simple. No theatrics, no self-glory, just truth. He said he made a promise to his mother that he would not continue without his father. And with that promise, he walked away. Undefeated, unbroken, unmatched. In that act, he did something few ever do. He ended his career on his own terms. He bowed out not when he needed to, but when he chose to. That choice shocked many. But for those who truly knew him, it made perfect sense. Because legacy for Khabib was never about clinging to the spotlight. It was about knowing when to step out of it with dignity. In stepping away, he left a silence in the sport. A void. Not just in the lightweight division, but in the spirit of the UFC itself. The cage felt different without him. The build-up to events lost some of their meaning. And while new stars emerged, none carried the same stillness, the same gravity. Because Khabib didn't just dominate, he elevated. He brought depth to a sport often reduced to highlight reels. He turned violence into poetry, strategy into art. And when he left, fans around the world didn't just miss his grappling, they missed what he stood for, what he represented. A kind of purity rarely seen. But walking away wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new mission. One where the gloves were replaced by guidance. He began coaching, training, mentoring. And in this new chapter, something incredible happened. His fire didn't dim. It spread. Through every fighter he trained, every youth he spoke to, every lesson he passed down, his influence multiplied. He didn't just teach techniques, he taught mindset, resilience, restraint, focus. And now, as his protégés rise in ranks, it's not just his legacy that continues, it's his values. His fingerprints are all over the next generation, and they carry his name not as a banner, but as a bond. One of the most powerful examples of that bond is Islam Makhachev, a fighter cut from the same cloth, raised under the same discipline, driven by the same code. When Islam ascended to the title, it wasn't just a personal victory, it was a confirmation. A statement that the system works. That Khabib's blueprint, carved in Dagestan's mountains and refined through years of sacrifice, can produce champions beyond himself. And when Khabib hoisted Islam's hand, you could see it in his eyes. Pride, not for dominance, but for continuation. This was legacy in motion. Not frozen in time, but evolving, growing, spreading like roots. And yet, even as he celebrates others, Khabib keeps himself anchored. He lives modestly, speaks sparingly, appears rarely. That scarcity makes every word hit harder, every appearance feel sacred. He's not just a figure anymore, he's become almost mythic. But instead of being unreachable, he remains deeply human. He laughs easily, prays daily, loves fully. And through it all, he never lets the weight of his influence crush his soul. He remains that same boy from Sildi who wrestled bears and trained in the forest. That same student of Abdulmanap, who rose not to be famous but to make his people proud. His story by now is etched in history, but it's still being written in the hearts of those who hear it. Young men fighting through adversity in silence. Fathers trying to raise sons with patience and strength. Coaches pouring into their students not for fame, but for faith. His story isn't just a tale, it's a torch, passed from one generation to the next. A light in places where hope is rare. And that's what makes Khabib's legacy so powerful. It doesn't end with him. It begins again and again, wherever someone decides to live with honor, fight with focus, and lead with humility. And yet, for all the impact he's made, Khabib never asks for anything in return. No statues, no titles, no endless accolades. He just wants people to live better, to treat their parents well, to serve their communities, to stay true to their faith, whatever that may be. In a world built on image, he reminds us that real power is quiet, that greatness isn't what you take, it's what you give. And in that quiet giving, he has become immortal. Not in the way stories often exaggerate, but in the way real legacy always lives. Through action, through others, through love. So where does the story go from here? That's the most powerful part. It's up to us. Khabib lit the path, but he never claimed to be the destination. He showed what's possible, not just in victory, but in character. And now it's in our hands. In the choices we make when no one's watching. In the values we uphold when it's inconvenient. In the fights we choose, not just in sport, but in life. Because if Khabib's journey taught us anything, it's that the true championship isn't won in the cage. It's won in the mirror. Every single day. As Khabib's legacy echoed louder, it became more than just a story of a fighter. It evolved into a blueprint for life, one that transcended the physical realm and entered the spiritual, moral, and emotional layers of the human experience. He made people question what success really meant. Was it trophies on a shelf or peace in the heart? Was it applause in an arena or silence in prayer? For him, it was always about alignment between what you do and who you are. That alignment, once achieved, gave him a rare kind of power, the ability to walk away from greatness and still grow bigger after leaving it behind. It became clearer with each passing year that Khabib wasn't chasing a legacy, he was living one. He didn't plan for headlines or documentaries, he planned for peace, for purpose, for the kind of impact that doesn't need to be filmed to matter. And in doing so, he showed the world something radical, that strength isn't found in force alone. Sometimes it's found in restraint. Sometimes saying no takes more courage than stepping forward. And in a culture that constantly pushes for more fame, more money, more dominance, he stood still, like a mountain, and reminded us, sometimes enough is everything. People began to realize that his decisions weren't emotional, they were principled. Calculated not by opportunity, but by values. When he turned down massive fights, tempting offers, and lucrative fame-driven appearances, it wasn't about pride. It was about protection of his soul, his peace, his family's dignity, the things that really mattered. And for those watching closely, it was a lesson in boundaries, in self-respect, in the art of protecting your legacy, not by extending it endlessly, but by preserving its integrity. That's the part most people miss. Real legends don't die out. They step back before they're forced to fade. And Khabib's philosophy didn't just stay in Dagestan or in MMA gyms. It filtered into classrooms, locker rooms, dinner tables. People shared his quotes, his routines, his lifestyle. Not to copy, but to calibrate, to adjust themselves back to center. You'd hear young athletes say they wanted to be like Khabib, not because he was flashy, but because he was true. Because he didn't fold under pressure. Because he prayed when others partied. Because he smiled when others mocked. And slowly he became more than a role model. He became a measuring stick, a mirror, a moment of pause in a world obsessed with noise. What's even more profound is how his influence sparked change in how others viewed Islam. In a time when misconceptions were rampant, Khabib offered a different lens. Not through debate or anger, but through example, through grace, through unwavering character. He didn't preach, he embodied. And in doing so, he humanized millions who had felt misunderstood, misrepresented, or invisible. He showed that faith and discipline weren't barriers, they were superpowers. And for those who saw him carry his religion with confidence and peace, many began to ask deeper questions. Not about him, about themselves. What do I stand for? What guides me? What keeps me grounded? That's the secret to his staying power. He doesn't demand attention, he invites reflection. He doesn't ask you to be like him, he asks you to be better than you were yesterday. And in this way, he plants seeds, quietly, consistently, in every young fighter who trains with dignity, in every father who leads with honor, in every business leader who chooses ethics over shortcuts. His name may not be in the headlines every day, but his impact is everywhere. Because Khabib didn't chase trends, he became a foundation, one you could build on, one you could return to when everything else fell apart. And when you look at the younger generation now rising from Dagestan, strong, focused, humble, you realize his work is far from over. In fact, it may have just begun. Because Khabib didn't just teach them how to win, he taught them how to carry themselves when they do. He taught them how to handle pressure, how to value their families, how to walk away if walking away meant staying true. He gave them something money can't buy and fans can't give, a standard. And once that standard is established, you can't unsee it. You measure everything else against it. That's when you know someone's influence is eternal. Even those who once doubted him began to shift. Fighters who used to mock his style now study it. Critics who questioned his choices now quote his wisdom. He didn't demand their respect, he earned it, with patience, with consistency, with results. And in doing so, he redefined what dominance looks like. It's not just about being better, it's about making others better. It's about walking into a room and raising the standard without saying a word. That's what Khabib does. He changes atmospheres. And not by yelling, but by being undeniable. A presence you feel, even in his silence. But perhaps the most poetic part of his journey is this. Khabib never set out to be a legend. He just set out to honor his father, to protect his name, to serve his faith. And in doing so, he stumbled into something greater than fame. He became timeless. Not because of how many fights he won, but because of how few principles he lost. And that, in the end, is what resonates most. That a man faced with all the temptations of power chose purpose instead. That when the world pulled him one way, he followed his own compass. And because of that, generations will follow him. Now, when you hear the name Khabib, it's more than a name. It's a signal, a reminder, a challenge. It tells you that you don't have to sell out to stand out. That you don't need to scream to be heard. That you can protect what you love without becoming someone you hate. And for those still grinding in silence, still chasing something bigger than applause, his story is the proof they need to keep going. Because if he could rise from a tiny mountain village and shake the world without ever losing himself, then maybe, just maybe, so can we. When the cage is locked and two fighters stand across from each other, the world watches. But what Khabib taught us is that the real battles are fought long before that moment, and long after it ends. In quiet gyms, in early morning prayers, in moments of doubt that no one sees. That's where character is carved. That's where resilience is shaped. And for Khabib, it was never about the fight. It was about who you became through it. Winning wasn't the goal. It was the byproduct of years of becoming unshakable, of building something no opponent could punch through: identity. He knew fame was fleeting. That cheers today could become criticism tomorrow. So he never let those external voices dictate his internal rhythm. He walked through storms with a calm most people couldn't understand. And maybe that's why his silence spoke louder than some fighters' entire careers. It wasn't empty, it was full of intention. Every word measured, every action considered. And because of that discipline, he moved like a man with nothing to prove and everything to protect. His father's teachings, his mother's pride, his people's trust. That was his belt. That was his reward. As time passed and new fighters stepped into the spotlight, many tried to follow the blueprint, but they often missed the foundation. It wasn't just about training like Khabib. It was about thinking like him, living like him. That meant doing the right thing even when no one was looking. It meant walking away from drama, not toward it. It meant honoring your elders even when the world told you to only honor yourself. That mindset isn't taught in a gym, it's built in a home. And that's why Khabib's story is as much about family as it is about fighting. You can see it in every interview, every answer he gives. His voice soft but firm. He's not trying to win arguments. He's trying to share a perspective, one forged through faith and fire. And when he talks about his father, there's a reverence in his tone. Not sadness, not regret, but peace. Because even though Abdulmanap is gone physically, his presence lives on in every principle Khabib lives by. That's the mark of true influence. Not what you do while you're here, but what you leave behind that keeps breathing through others. And in a world that worships self, Khabib chose to serve. He used his platform not to elevate himself, but to uplift others. Whether it was funding schools, supporting charities, or mentoring youth, he gave back quietly, No big announcements, no flashy headlines, just action. And in those actions, he reminded us of something crucial, that giving is the highest form of wealth. That status means nothing if it's not used to help those without it. That legacy isn't measured in what you take, but in what you leave behind for others to rise from. There's something sacred in how he chose to live after fighting. He didn't chase the spotlight. He retreated into simplicity, family dinners, nature walks, teaching the next generation. And in doing so, he created a kind of peace most champions never find. Because many athletes get addicted to attention. They don't know who they are without the crowd. But Khabib knew all along. He knew he was more than a fighter, more than a belt. He was a son, a father, a believer.